So, welcome everyone, and it's great to see everybody's face today. I'm Christian Harrison. I'm a reader in the School of Business and Creative Industries. I'm privileged to also be the facilitator of this research seminar series held by the Business School. And we have had these seminars over time, and a lot of people have been attending. So thank you for coming. And it's been a very fantastic one. And we have approached December. This is the first day of December. So technically we're getting to the end of the year. So that's scary as well. But it's great to see everyone here. I always tell people, and I think we started this, because we are always many, I don't like getting everybody to introduce themselves personally. But because we are doing this virtually, it's always great to tell us where you're coming from. So please feel free to use the chat box and just say hi. So anywhere you are, I know Paulette is not in Scotland, and she's very far from us at the moment. So say hi to us, tell us where you're coming from. Sometimes, I think it was a speaker that said months ago that you feel free to introduce yourself in your native language. So if you're Welsh, feel free to use your Welsh. If you're Chinese and you want to use Mandarin, do what you want to do. If you're Nigerian and you're Yoruba, you can introduce yourself in your native language. That would be great. But it's great to see everyone's faces, really, despite the challenges that we're having personally, and of course with the COVID situation, things are also, they're trying to do everything that we can. But rather than focus on all that, of course, we know the ground rules of Zoom. Please try to mute yourself when you're not talking. Like I said before, feel free to put your camera on and let's just see your face. You can, but if, of course, you have to take away your videos, no problem at all. If there's an emergency, please don't hesitate to leave your computer. Unfortunately, we don't have lunch to give you here, so you can get a glass of water as well. So you're free to do all that. But of course, you didn't come to hear all that. You came to listen to a very, very interesting seminar today. No pressure, Mohammed, but I've been waiting for this. It's of course, apart from the fact that I have a lived experience because I'm also BAME, but I've never worked in the library before. But it's great to have this talk. Like I said, we've had several seminars, but this to me is going to be another highlight of our year. And we're going to be looking at BAME employees, or what we call the Black, Asian, minority ethnic employees, their work experience in the UK public sector, an empirical study of academic and research libraries. So Dr. Mohammed Ishaq has examined the academic libraries. And so coincidentally, we have some well-established librarians here today. So I don't know whether that's coincidence, but I'm not saying anything. But it's going to be great to hear Mohammed's view about the challenges and implications of BAME employees within the library. This research is novel. Mohammed will be telling you so much about the funding he has gotten from this, and of course, everything that he's achieved over time. But of course, first, I would like to also introduce Mohammed himself. I try to summarize Mohammed's CV because Mohammed's CV is very, very elaborate. So I will just provide a synopsis of who Mohammed is. Of course, many of you already know Mohammed because he is our own. We're privileged to have him in the business school. But Mohammed is a reader in human resource management at University of West of Scotland, and is also a fellow of the Chartered Management Institute. Mohammed has engaged in multidisciplinary research over the past 20 years. So Mohammed has a strong research background and in the disciplines of sociology, politics, and a wider discipline of business and management. He's an expert in equity or equality, diversity, and inclusion. So he has been involved in different advisory bodies looking at that. He's engaged in research that looks at organizations and societies and communities. Mohammed has published in several peer-reviewed journals. And of course, he's a consultant for different establishments, even the Scottish government as well. Mohammed is a member of a number of organizations, including the Diversity and Equality Alliance Refresher Group and the Scottish Football Association Equality and Diversity Advisory Board. Mohammed will tell you that during his spare time, he likes football as well. So maybe that's one of the things that he does. But this is just a summary of what Mohammed is going to bring to the table. So I don't want to talk too much. I think we'll have Mohammed say much about it. But within the next 20, 30 minutes, Mohammed would introduce this very engaging topic, What you need to do is keep your questions. Then there will be a time for you to ask questions as well. Feel free to use the chat box to put the questions there. If you feel like I have to have the questions in the chat box and you don't want to say it personally, but it's going to be a very engaging one. So thanks everyone for coming, and I will give Dr. Mohammed Ishaq the stage to start the presentation. Thanks, Mohammed.
Thank you very much, Christian, and it's an absolute pleasure to be invited to the seminar series. And great work, Christian, that you're doing behind the scenes and getting these seminars off the ground. We used to have, these seminar series in the past, but then we had a bit of a gap there, but we reconvened those. So it's great to see so many colleagues and friends here today, actually, so for me to talk about this research. So as Christian was saying, I'm going to spend about 20 to 25 minutes since I've lost 5 minutes, Christian, so to get my research. So I've got quite a lot of slides, no problem. I've got quite a lot of slides to get through, and I'll try and go through them fairly quickly, but you'll definitely have opportunities for discussion and debate, which is the bit I'm really looking forward to. So this study is focusing on a report that I did for SCONO, and I'll elaborate on that in a second, back in July 2019. So there's a couple of you here, including my esteemed colleague Jeanette from the library, who will know about the study already, that was published in the SCONO report in 2019. And I'm just waiting for a revised version of that of this study to be published in the International Journal of Public Sector Management. It's due out early next year. I don't know what edition yet, but certainly I'll indicate that at a later stage. I deliberately tried to avoid making this presentation too theoretical or academic. I'm certainly happy to answer questions to do with theories or frameworks, but I think what was important today was to get the lived experience of BAME staff working in libraries across to you, so that you can get a feel for their understanding and reflect on that. Unfortunately, my slides, if you were looking for some very snazzy slides with fantastic backgrounds, you're going to be disappointed. My slides are all very basic, and given some of the topics that have been covered in this particular subject today, I think having plain slides probably actually makes more sense anyway. Because there's some really, very honest and frank information coming out here. So without any further ado, I will, move on. I hope you can see the slides okay? Yep. So this study came about as a result of a consultancy offer made by SCONO, which is a Society for College and National University Libraries. Now, some of you, I'm hoping that most of you will have heard of SCONO. I remember when I was a student at Glasgow Uni, we used to have a SCONO card. We used to pay a small fee, and it allowed us to use the libraries of other universities who were also members of SCONO. I'm not sure if they actually still operate that policy. Jeanette might know, or Jenny might know, but certainly, I used to have, I think I've still got the old SCONO card somewhere, which allowed me to get into all sorts of different universities to cause mischief. But certainly, and what SCONO had been working on was they had been getting some background information that there were some issues involving staff who were from ethnic minority backgrounds, and they were very keen to commission a study to explore the lived experience of Black, Asian, and minority ethnic staff working in the higher education sector, particularly from the point of view of the academic and research library sector. When I bid for this and was successful in taking on this consultancy project, I was very interested, obviously, as an academic, to look at some of the background work that had been done on this area. And there wasn't an awful lot. There are significant gaps in studies and research conducted on EDI in relation to library profession. We know there is information out there on universities. We know that there are lots of issues facing BAME staff working in universities, for example, academic staff and students, etc. But very little attention had been given to library staff, particularly in academic and research libraries. However, there have been some work which I did explore before I commenced the piece of research. And in 2015, there was work done by Alabi in the US, which looked at racial microaggression experienced by BAME staff in academic libraries in the US. And this study was, replicated by Brooke, Ellenwood, and Lazaro in the same year. And they did a study that looked at the persistence of racism and what they called a culture of whiteness in US academic libraries. And this was, purely, as I said, across the Atlantic. The only main study prior to mine that had been done on this area in relation to the UK was by Williams and Nicholas in 2009, who carried out a very small-scale qualitative study looking at the low representation of BAME staff in the library and information profession in London. So these were the sort of three kind of key studies specific to the library profession and race that appear to be in existence at the moment. And I'm hoping certainly that, having added my research to that, there'll be other people, going to take this a bit more seriously and follow up on that. I'm going to move on to that, but look at the methodology now. Because this study was focusing on the lived experiences of BAME staff, obviously a qualitative approach seemed to be the most appropriate way forward for this. And what I did in phase one was I carried out a focus group of BAME staff to extract key issues that were coming out. We already knew some of the issues coming out anecdotally from evidence that had been passed on to SCONO via various individuals. But we didn't really have any specific formal way of saying here are definitive results in terms of what BAME staff are feeling in the library and academic sector. Phase two was then a continuation of the focus group. The issues, some of the key issues that were explored that came out of phase one were then explored in greater detail through individual interviews with BAME staff. Now, what I've done for the purpose of this particular presentation is just to, obviously to save time, I'm not going to go through, issues that were specific to focus groups and to interviews. I've just merged them all because a lot of issues that came out were more or less exactly the same. And I'm going to present those, during the course of this presentation. But in terms of recruiting, what happened was SCONO carried out a demographic survey of BAME staff who were working in their member libraries. And what they did was they basically carried out a very basic survey in which they asked those who identified as BAME to complete a series of questions and also indicate whether they'd be interested in taking part in this qualitative commission study. And out of the survey respondents, of which there was, quite a few, we had around 20 people indicating interest in the focus group, of which I recruited around 9, in keeping with, the kind of ideal number for a focus group is usually between sort of 6 and 10. So 9, we interviewed, took 9 focus group participants. For interviews, we had approximately 20 to 22 people indicating interest, and we chose 14. The reason for choosing 14 really was just more down to kind of, diaries and time pressures of trying to get this project completed within a set period of time. But I thought 14 was a reasonable number, of people to recruit, given it was a qualitative piece of work. When I was looking at the people who had indicated interest, I looked at some of their demographic variables. So I wanted to make sure that the sample recruited for both the focus group and for the interviews were reasonably representative of various variables. So I looked at things like gender to make sure that we had a reasonable spread of male and female library staff. The job roles are there. So, we're looking at both professional and non-professional library staff. The ethnicity, so we were looking at people from Black African, Black Caribbean, Indian, Pakistani communities, Chinese. Religion and belief, wanted to get another diverse representation from people who either believed in a particular religion or who had either no belief in a religion. Geographic region, of course, we were very keen to ensure that we didn't just get people recruited from one specific area, like say London, where there was obviously a larger percentage of diverse people working in libraries there. So those kind of demographic variables were considered in order to make the sample as representative as possible. What I want to do now is go on to look at the themes that were explored and, then build on some of those. So given what we knew about the experience of BAME staff anecdotally, and given what we wanted to find out, we came up with a list of around 7 themes that we would explore. So we look at that self-awareness of being a BAME member of staff. We wanted to get a sense of whether the level of consciousness that BAME library staff had about their ethnicity, because that can often have a bearing on their experience. Whether they had experienced the racial discrimination in the workplace and the level and extent of that discrimination, what kind of relationship they had with line managers and colleagues, what their views were on the level of workforce diversity, because that seemed to be a key problem within the library and information profession. What kind of training and development opportunities they had access to. What they thought about their career progression and promotion opportunities, and what was their overall view on the state of equality and diversity in their actual organizations. So these were the areas that we initially put out to explore. So what I'm going to present to you now is a series of findings from this qualitative piece of research. And obviously I've not made any reference to names or people or even which focus group participant or interviewee said this, because I just wanted to keep this as anonymous as possible. So you might find that there's a lot of very strong views expressed by BAME staff in quotes, and I'm very grateful, obviously, for people being very honest and open about their experiences. And I think this was one of the most things I found fascinating about the research, how open people were in that safe space to me. So the first one was BAME staff felt under pressure to perform to a higher standard than their white counterparts and feel that they're being monitored. So if you look at some of those quotes here, you've got someone indicating that they're not sure if they are more closely monitored, but they definitely feel that they have to get recognition. They have, to work that bit harder than their white colleagues. So there was a sense of that they had to prove more in the workplace than their white colleagues. And then that second one there, I think it kind of puts a lot of pressure on you. If there's very few ethnic minorities represented in the staff, you do feel that extra, pressure of representing not just your profession, but your race as well. So that, I think, was an indication of how conscious people were of their ethnicity, that they felt that they had a lot to prove because they were seen as being different in the workplace. And that level of consciousness added to their sense of being monitored. So here's a few, again, strong quotes. Sometimes you feel that you don't have the face that fits. So here someone clearly thinks that because they are, of different ethnicity, different race, color, they kind of feel as if they're kind of, it's somewhere where they don't quite feel comfortable, or others don't feel comfortable about them being there. I think that sometimes people are quite surprised when I speak talking, and I have got a very British accent, and it does not, match the way I look. Well, I know that feeling as well, personally. And I remember actually doing this a presentation to the heads of libraries in the Scotland conference a couple of years ago, and it was like I got that startling look from all the library directors. I think some of them were actually quite taken in by this as well. So there is that sense of consciousness about people being monitored and because of their ethnicity. One of the areas that has been a real concern in the library sector has been the lack of ethnic diversity of the workforce. Now, if you actually look at the fact that universities are very diverse places, we have so many students from different countries. We have so many students, staff from different countries. A lot of our, we're also blessed to have staff from so many different, ethnic backgrounds. And I think that just helps in terms of delivering our student experience, etc. But there was a sense that this was really lacking and that there wasn't enough importance given to this particular area. So if you see some of those, the quotes here, there is a whiteness in libraries that certainly where the university I'm working at is not reflected in the student cohort. So there was someone who felt that they were working in an institution where students were very diverse, but the libraries didn't appear to have that level of diversity. Someone wrote, I do enjoy it because I'm such a minority. There is a subconscious feeling that you're not part of the whole big library team. You feel that there is some sort of subconscious racism there. So this is someone who probably hasn't experienced direct racism, but has that perception that they are being treated or looked at in a different way because of their ethnicity. Then someone said, I think an ethnically diverse workforce is really important. You're able to experience different things from a diverse workforce. A diverse workforce is more successful. They are more innovative and more creative. And I think we would all accept that argument. And I think this person is alluding to the business case for why there should be diversity. So they want to just go beyond just talking about the social justice aspect of the, morally right for us to try to diversify our workforce to be more representative of our communities. But this individual is actually talking about the fact that we are losing out on the creativity and innovation that comes from having people from different backgrounds. Moving then on to look at issues to do with progression and promotion, there was a strong perception that the upper echelons of the library profession were dominated by white individuals and that there were institutional barriers that hindered progression of BAME staff. And this goes back to those of you who have heard of the terms glass ceiling, which is often applied to people unable to progress beyond a certain level in the organization. And I think the technical term often used is vertical segregation, and it used to be applied a lot to staff, people in the organization, particularly for females who were unable to get to the top positions. And if you look at some of those quotes, they're very hard-hitting quotes. I think the promotion opportunities are limited unless my director dies, right? Someone said there is very limited experience for promotion within the library service. And I remember when I read out this quote to the library directors, some of them just started shivering almost as if worried about their positions. But I don't know whether that was reference to the fact that it is a very strong statement, but I think that might be reference to the fact that people felt that, sometimes the directors were not retiring quickly enough, and maybe they just held on to their positions for so long and weren't giving other people an opportunity. I think the highest grade that you'll see a person of colour would be librarian grade. You wouldn't see anything higher than that. I think there is actually a number of people from BAME backgrounds who actually do have higher positions, because I actually met some of them, during the conference. But I think this was a very general comment from someone who felt that in general, there wasn't that opportunity. I then went on to explore the issue of training and development. Training and development opportunities were generally perceived to be adequate, but opportunities were lower for non-professional staff, for example, library assistants, than for professional staff, such as librarians. This had a greater adverse impact on BAME staff, as they were perceived as being overrepresented at the lower end. So the problem was that although training and development opportunities were generally adequate, because they tended to be available in more greater quantity, if you like, to professional staff. If you were in the non-professional job role, then you didn't really get the chance to take advantage of those. And again, technically, we use the term horizontal segregation to refer to certain groups of staff, whether that's women or ethnic minorities, being overrepresented at the lower ends of the job spectrum than at the higher ends. So I think this had a kind of knock-on effect. And I think the next quote highlights that. I think that's interesting, the lack of training opportunities, because when I was working as a library assistant, there were very few opportunities beyond the mandatory training for me. Whereas as a librarian, they're a bit more sort of open to suggestions and allowed me to go to any events or training that I've asked for. If you're sort of higher level, the training opportunities are potentially greater. So I think there was a feeling that there was an element of unfairness or unequal opportunities for those who were at the lower ends. And if they weren't getting the training and development opportunities, they end up becoming stuck at those levels and weren't really moving to the next level. There was an element of acknowledgement among participants that institutions and libraries had put in place measures to advance equality and diversity, but these were either not seen as going far enough, or they were seen as publicity stunts, just seem to be doing something. And that quote, I've just put up that if people want to see a change, and if you believe that you are the people that affect change and you are the gatekeepers of that, it then boils down to courage. Seeing a person like me every day is a challenge for some people. White people don't want to be challenged. And this was, I thought, a very strong quote from someone who probably had felt uncomfortable in their workplace and maybe had certain negative experiences. I then went on to ask about workplace racism. Because if you're doing any study on EDI, particularly related to race, then it's only important that you find out about what people's perceptions were of whether they had faced any workplace racism. Because we assume, of course, that all those things are absolutely fine, but we don't in reality what people are experiencing. So whilst workplace racism was not viewed rampant, it wasn't like happening all the time and it wasn't out of control, it did exist. Some at the hands of service users, for example, students. Yes, unfortunately, I remember hearing about cases where students had been racially discriminated towards BAME staff working in the library, and some at the hands of staff. The experience of racism at the hands of staff centered primarily on the issue of inappropriate language and ignorance about cultural issues. So not all the sort of microaggressions or things that people experience were deliberate, in the sense that sometimes it was just sheer ignorance. People didn't realize, maybe subconscious bias came into it and they needed to look at. So the following quotes highlight that. Someone said, I have a colleague, I have had instances of colleagues who keep getting my name wrong, and I don't think my first name is that difficult. Maybe it is some sort of unconscious bias. I remember this participant actually, because I remember interviewing this participant, and I think his name was only 4 letters and it was so simple to say. So I think that's why he was a bit frustrated. Someone wrote, well, it tends to be comments. So for example, a while ago, it was a supervisor. Another colleague had made a comment. I think it was something like he was arguing with another colleague about religion or belief in God. I was sat at a different desk, but he walked over and said, what about Islam? What kind of religion is that? And I said, sorry, what was that? He said, oh, nothing. And I think it was the way the person approached him to say, what about Islam? What kind of religion is that? It wasn't as if they came and said, oh, I want to know about Islam. I'm really fascinated with the religion. But it was the way it came across. It came across almost in a kind of negative connotation to it, that, he didn't like the religion, and he was basically saying, what does that religion all about? So there was applying a kind of negative connotation there. And then there was a few other comments. Someone wrote, for some reason, we seem to get each other's emails. There is another colleague called, and they had the same name. Our names are totally different and we don't look alike and we don't work closely together. So why does this keep happening? So I don't know whether that was something generally that was happening that was discriminatory, or whether it was that the person who was doing this was incompetent. I don't know whether, which one of those it was, and I don't know whether it was more than one person who was actually doing it. We do have issues at the point of co-workers, that I have some lovely people that I work with, really, great people that I work with and who are particularly supportive, but I have some that I know are just seeking to put a dagger in. So these are people who are feeling uncomfortable about the fact that they work with some people who are really helpful and supportive, but then you've got those other ones that they've got to watch out for. And I think that happens, I suppose, in a lot of organizations. It may not be necessarily something that is endemic to, to sort of BAME staff, if you like, but certainly, obviously, we were looking at the perceptions of BAME staff, so it was important to draw our attention to that. I think the other concern was that complaints of racism were not dealt with adequately, in that there was a sense of a lack of institutional will to address racism. So I think there was a perceived ineffectiveness of the personnel department. There was a lack of willingness to be sued or take it anywhere, so you will lose out because it will not support you. And I think it was organizations were deemed to be worried about having lawsuits against them and people taking action, and it felt they got very, very messy. But I think that was seen as a cop-out. It was seen as that's not the way to deal with it. You have to be more courageous and deal with these instances of discrimination when they arise. There was also a concern that trade unions were no longer doing enough to promote equality and diversity, and this created a sense that BAME staff were unprotected and lacked adequate workplace representative voice. Because often in the workplace, when you have an issue, you join a union. You're either already a member of a union, but the way unions often work is, even if you're not a member of a union, quite often they will still support you. They won't just leave you unsupported. But there's a sense, unfortunately, that trade unions were actually not doing their bit. And I think this hard-hitting quote was, the unions are useless. I wouldn't join a union. Unions were formed to keep Black people out of work. Anyway, I've never had a positive or constructive engagement with a union. I don't see what the unions do in a way to make my experience as a BAME person any better within the organization. So I think this was a case of someone who had a negative experience. They had possibly approached the unions for assistance or support and felt that they actually got nowhere with it. And you know, this is obviously, you know, the views of a participant, and you know, but obviously we've all had different experiences. Some of us may already be union members and maybe have used their services. So I wouldn't like to, you know, to stand here and say that I agree with that comment necessarily. You know, there may be a lot of stuff that unions do, I'm sure, are very positive in terms of protecting employee rights and ensuring a positive employment relationship. But certainly this was someone who felt really, really strong about the fact that unions had not given them enough support. There was also someone who, you know, a couple of people who commented on the relationship with line managers, and although they generally had a good relationship with the line managers, they felt that they were not encouraged to, you know, pursue promotion. So whilst they got on well with the line manager didn't make any effort to say, okay, you know, you should apply, you'll be good for a leadership role. So someone said, I've asked my line manager about it, you know, what are the opportunities for progression? And I wouldn't say she was overly enthusiastic. And my experience has been, I will go around because I don't feel as though somebody's actually looking out for me. And even if you're performing well, it's very hard to get someone to acknowledge it. And this was people who felt that they were not being, you know, they were not being put forward, even although they felt that they had the skills and qualities to get to that higher level. I'll try and rattle through the remaining slides quickly because I know we're not quite past the time limit, but we did start a wee bit later. Resilience. Despite the workplace challenges acknowledged by BAME staff, what was really interesting and positive to know from this research was that, you know, not many people said they're going to walk away from their career. They wanted to stay and make the library profession better when it came to equality and diversity. So here's a couple of interesting quotes. It's an interesting career and it's not just about stamping books. There is more to it than that. A lot of people don't know, and I'm pretty sure our library colleagues here today can enlighten us on the fantastic variety of roles that they all perform. And it's not just the stereotypical view of library staff. I would say definitely go for it because we do need more of us. You know, it is completely normal for me to go to meetings and I am literally the only person who is not white. You know, and again, you know, there's a sense of camaraderie there about feeling that if you had more staff from BAME backgrounds, the place would be better in terms of the benefit you get from diversity, but also in terms of the experience that staff could have. They feel like a kind of strength in numbers. So that concludes my findings. So I wanted to move on to recommendations quickly, just the last couple of slides. And because what now, where do we go from here? So based on what we got from the feedback and the qualitative research and discussions across the different stakeholders, we talked about zero tolerance approach to racial discrimination being important when dealing with complaints. There seemed to be a feeling that, you know, organizations were saying, oh, there's a zero tolerance approach here, but in practice, it wasn't happening. People were still being discriminated and finding they were putting up with particularly verbal, assaults on their ethnicity. Better race awareness training to address unconscious bias and encourage cultural and behavior change. The only way to change the culture and behavior is better race awareness training. Mentorship system to help promotion opportunities. I think a lot of BAME staff felt that they could do with some mentor and someone to support them, to guide them to get to that next level. Partnership for change, work with various stakeholders to promote librarianship as a profession to BAME communities. So work with external and internal stakeholders. Obviously, a lot of the SCONAL members are actually members of university. They're part of a wider institutional network. So they need to work within with those wider university structures to try and get this kind of change needed. Leadership of libraries to lead from the top and make equality and diversity a strategic priority, ensure that there are adequate financial resources. We want leadership to become effective agents of change. You know, so one of the problems is that in the studies I did in the past on the armed forces for the Ministry of Defence, we noticed great progress made by the armed forces, particularly the Army, the Navy, the Air Force in the UK. You know, at times they were accused of being sexist, homophobic and racist. Now, whilst we're not going to sit here and say that they've suddenly turned over a new leaf and there isn't any sexism or racism or homophobia in the armed forces, there has been a significant improvement over the last 10 to 15 years in terms of the armed forces of the UK. And that has been driven a lot by leadership being very proactive and being transformative and looking at things from a different perspective rather than from the old-fashioned perspective. Provide greater opportunities for employee voice to BAME staff. You know, the idea of setting up specific staff networks. And I'm pleased to say, based on these recommendations, there is a staff network that came into being last year during COVID for BAME staff specifically to tackle these issues. Monitor ethnic diversity to ensure that workforce reflects the user base. At the moment, SCONO members do not monitor the diversity of the workforce, but that's something that is going to change. And I've just completed some research looking at EDI data among SCONO members, and I've just reported my recommendations to SCONO about how to take that forward. And I'm hoping to report that in possibly a future seminar if I get invited. And provide BAME staff with a clear pathway towards vision of the career development. Line managers should encourage BAME staff with managerial potential to engage in conversations with those staff during performance appraisal. They should be seeking out staff from BAME backgrounds who they feel can become leaders, have the ability to lead other staff. So just quickly, conclusion then. What this research demonstrated that the issues faced by BAME library staff are not endemic to the library academic sector. These are not something that is just happening in academic libraries. It's happening all around the public sector. We see bullying and discrimination faced by BAME staff in the NHS, which is one of the largest organisations in not just in the UK, actually in the world, together with the Ministry of Defence, the Chinese Army, and the Indian Railways are among the 4 biggest organisations in the world. So bullying and discrimination faced by BAME staff in the NHS, culture of harassment in the Metropolitan Police, a lot of stories about a culture of harassment towards diverse and ethnic minority groups and women in Metropolitan Police, and a lack of diversity at leadership level of big organisations. And this is a problem because organisations which are lacking leadership, diversity at leadership level are the ones that are consistently being accused of having a poor track record on EDI. So the key contribution of this research was to help us shed light on the employment experience of BAME staff, give them an opportunity to have a say. Their voice doesn't get heard very often, and also to make sure that we don't forget the academic and library sector, even though it's embedded within the wider institutional context. It is important that we respect the fact that the academic library sector has issues which it needs help with, but they're not endemic to them, they're happening elsewhere. But what can the library sector do itself to improve that situation? So there are a number of kind of takeaways for public managers. Anyway, that concludes my presentation, and I hope I've kept to a reasonable time limit. I think it was exactly half an hour, Christian. So over to you guys now for any questions anyone has. And I can stop sharing if you want me to stop sharing now. Yeah,
you can stop sharing. Thanks very much, Mohammed, for that. I think it was a great presentation. It was very informative and interesting. And I don't want to start asking any questions now, but it's up to the participants. So any questions for Dr. Mohammed Ishaq? Anything that you want to ask, any comments, any feedback? So anything that you want to say? So this is the time for you to. So I could even share your experience, anything at all you want to say.
Thanks, Christian. It's Paulette here.
Paulette, how are you?
Hi, sorry I haven't got my camera on. It's not a pretty sight, so.
No problem at all.
Thanks very much for the presentation. That was really interesting. Two questions really. I was glad to see you mentioned leadership in the recommendations, but I wondered if the critical thing about leadership is the building of leadership capacity for systemic change. I mean, I think it's one thing providing resources, but actually, is there something about building leadership capacity so that systemic change is possible? And should some of that systemic change be about more rigorous structures, for example, performance management, performance review? That's one question. The other question is there any evidence about organisations where it's been found that where one group of employees are treated badly, the reality is that all employees are treated badly. So that kind of correlation, research in terms of that kind of correlation.
Okay, Paulette, thank you for that. On the first question, I totally agree with you about capacity building for leadership, and I think that's really important. I think Green Park, which is a consultancy company, did a significant piece of research. It was mostly actually connected to the private sector, and it actually said that organisations which lacked diversity in leadership were actually less profitable than companies that were actually had a more diverse leadership. So I think you're right, the structures and systems in place at the moment need to change so that we can build that capacity. But we're only going to be able to build that capacity if line managers, the people who are managing staff from these different backgrounds, are actually willing to take those people under their wing and actually look at their qualities and skills and say, okay, do you know what, you are primed for leadership. You are certainly got an opportunity to play for leadership. And I think what we have to do is we have to, particularly in the case of the library sector, get people from the BAME backgrounds into those sort of job positions where they can have access to that opportunity, to have access to the training and development opportunities which they didn't have because they're overrepresented at the lower end. So yes, I absolutely agree with you on the issue of capacity building in terms of leadership. On your second point about, sorry, your second point was on the issue of
the second question.
Yeah, I got you. Sorry, yes, I got you. Yeah, it was about whether the experience of BAME staff was not just endemic to BAME staff, but was also perhaps experienced by other staff. I can't answer that because I don't have access to any particular evidence from SCONO, but I know SCONO has carried out, various libraries do carry out, I believe, and I think Jeanette and Jenny might be able to confirm that there must be some sort of attitude or employee surveys that are done every so often, of all staff. So I don't know whether there's any, I'm not aware in terms of any empirical research that suggests that there is a culture of bullying or a harassment across the academic or library sector at all. So I couldn't comment on whether these experiences are specific to BAME staff or whether it's specific to all different ethnicities there. Yeah.
I wasn't just referring to your sector. I mean, later on in your talk, you did talk about the police service, for example, yes, and the changes, and the NHS, for example. And it just seemed to me that maybe organisations that treat staff poorly overall, or have got a particularly negative culture overall, that has a particularly troubling effect on BME staff.
Yes, that's a good point, actually. Yeah, I agree with that. I think you're right. I think it's possible that organizations which do have that culture in the first place, it does seem to impact more negatively on certain communities. And I'll give you, in fact, one example just comes to mind. I said nothing to do with the library sector, is the armed forces. I've did some studies of EDI in relation to the armed forces for many years, and I think there has always, I think we all know, even from watching old films, if you like, that were based around particular garrisons and barracks and stuff like that, there's always been a kind of macho masculine culture in the armed forces, which which it negatively impacted not just on BAME members, but also impacted negatively on women, for example, on people who were from homosexual backgrounds. I mean, in fact, up until about the late 1990s, you couldn't join the British Armed Forces if you were homosexual. In the US, that policy didn't change until 2012 under Barack Obama. So yes, you're right. I agree with that. I think there is something to be said for the fact that organizations which have an overall issue with the culture and the way employees are treated, quite often this impacts a bit more negatively on BAME staff. So where there is evidence that BAME staff are being heavily discriminated against or treated badly, that might indicate a systemic problem within the organizations at particular levels that impacts on all employees.
I think thanks Mohammed for that, and thanks Paulette for the questions. One of the things that I think there are many questions coming in the chat. Okay, and Paulette is happy with it, so thanks, Paulette, for that. And then one of the things I really loved about your presentation or about your research is, like you said, most of these challenges are transferable. They're not just challenges linked to the library sector, even academia. These are challenges that BAME employees tend to face. Like when you speak about the fact that you look at the top and you see that there is no pressure, there is no, you're not motivated because everybody on top of you is white, in quotes. And or when you talk about lack of diversity in leadership, all these things, breaking the glass ceiling effect. And I'm happy with the recommendations that you proposed. One of the things that at the end, these recommendations, how do people really, we propose these recommendations every time, but how many times are these recommendations followed through? You as a member of the advanced HE committee, I know we worked on those kind of things and proposing these recommendations. Well, how can we ensure that these recommendations, of course, are really the universities or the libraries or NHS? How do we ensure that these recommendations are really, are really addressed, in quotes? But that might just be a rhetoric question. You don't need to answer that. But I think we'll go to Rachel's question. I think, Rachel, thank you so much for such an informative presentation. I'm interested to know if there was anything that surprised you during the research, anything perhaps unexpected that came out of the focus groups or interviews. So Rachel wants to find out, was there any shocker, anything that you didn't know, anything that surprised you during your focus groups or interviews, Mohammed?
Thank you for that question, Rachel. I think, yes, I think I was struck particularly by the honesty and frankness of the comments that I came across, particularly during the focus groups and some of the interviews. You know, people were very open about their experiences. And usually, you know, when you carry out research, you're never really sure whether people are really going to be willing to share their experiences. And I think what I found, I wouldn't say it was necessarily surprising, I suppose, because I think anecdotally we knew there were some issues going on, but I think what I noticed was how similar the comments were from participants, regardless of what ethnicity they were. So this wasn't just, you know, one particular ethnic group that were saying that they were facing all these issues. This was people from Black, from Asian, from other, Chinese backgrounds who were actually saying that they were facing these very similar. And I remember when I did the focus group in Birmingham back in 2019, we had approximately, we had obviously 9 participants. And, the focus group, could have probably lasted all night, because people were so hyped up about some of the issues that had been burning inside because they felt that they hadn't had that voice. So I would say that I was certainly struck, what would you call it, by the openness and frankness. So I don't know sure whether I would use the word surprise, but I think the openness of that. And I remember also when I went to the SCONAL conference to do the presentations on this research, I guess one of the things that did surprise me was how, easily the directors of libraries accepted these findings. No one really came back to me and said that, well, that's not actually true. I think that's unfair. I don't think that happens in our organization. It was almost an acceptance. Well, you know what? We're not really surprised that, you're telling us this because we know there is a problem. So there was an implicit understanding that, yes, lack of diversity, lack of promotion opportunities, these kinds of microaggressions that were coming out were real and people had experienced them. So I would say that I actually expected more of a defensive reaction. I expected more of the directors to stand up and say, hold on a second, that can't be true. I don't think our organization's like that. But I didn't get that sense at all.
Thanks very much, Mohammed, for that. And I think that answers the question. We have some very interesting comments and questions as well. I think okay, Temi has raised her hand. Maybe we'll go for Temi's question first, then we'll go back to the chat. So Temi.
All right, thank you, Dr. Mohammed, for such an interesting session. My question is on the methodology, especially the focus group part. How many focus groups did you have? Was it just one? And if it was just one, how and why did you decide on just one focus group?
Yeah, sorry.
Okay.
No, on you go, please. On you go.
Yeah, because I would assume that the more focus groups you have, the better the chances of you getting more diverse feedback from participants and the likelihood of more issues arising for you to analyze.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. It's a good question. I think in an ideal, as a researcher, I would love to have done 5 or 6 focus groups. I think the problem was, one, we were limited by budget. The second reason was the focus group wasn't seen to be the original way of carrying out the research, because obviously I was doing this piece of consultancy for an organization. So I really was in some ways going by what they wanted or what their needs were. And I think the interviews that I did, the 14 interviews I did, was trying to get the individual real life experiences of being staff. So the focus group in some ways was a bit of an extra. And the whole point of the focus group was to try and get a group working together and coming out with the issue that we can then take out and then explore in further detail. So I think that was the reason. You're right, we could have probably did another one. I'm not sure whether we would have got any more diversity, because the 9 members of staff that we recruited for focus groups were all very diverse in terms of ethnicity, in terms of their religious background, in terms of their gender, etc. So yes, in an ideal world, we'd love to have done more, but I'm not sure if they would have given us necessarily any greater value, because I think the emphasis was really on those kind of 14 one-to-one interviews, which explored some of those questions in detail. Yeah.
Okay, thanks very much, Mohammed, and thanks very much, Temi, for asking the question as well. I think it's getting very interesting. I think we have 3 questions, and we don't have so much time. But I think Janet made a comment saying, as a direct result of Mohammed's research, the Scottish Confederation of Universities and Research Libraries, Scotland, has set up an equality, diversity, and inclusion network to enable knowledge exchange and inform strategic direction in university and research libraries across Scotland. So that's great. So this is trying to show that what Mohammed has done has already shown impact, and the government already, or the universities and research libraries, have put a network in place to enable his findings to become policy. So well done, Mohammed, as well. Then going back to, I think somebody asked, so CNOX. Apologies, I had to skip out for some of the presentation. I was wondering if there was any major success or blueprints to follow for managers in the meantime. What have they done we could copy? Is it mainly unconscious bias training and a secure whistleblowing process clearly available? Totally agree about needing capacity building aspect for leadership as well. Without time to lead and not firefights, leading at the forefront is actually mentor and encouraging people. Managers do not have a hope. I think that question has partially been answered by Janet, but of course, maybe Mohammed, you want to explain better as well. So are there other success stories or blueprints to follow managers at the time?
I think it's always very difficult, isn't it? Because, as I said before, I go back to the research I did on the armed forces. They have made great strides in the last 15 to 20 years in terms of rooting out, things like sexism, homophobia, and racism. So much so that actually, a few years back, they were actually recommended for an award by Stonewall, which is the major gay rights organization. And 10, 15 years ago, you would have thought that absolutely unthinkable, because they wouldn't have even wanted people who were not heterosexual in the armed forces. So I think they're a success story, because if you look at where they started from a really bad reputation. They started from way down there. They were getting all sorts of complaints of racism, bullying, harassment on the basis of people's gender, race, and religion and sexual orientation. And now they are often regarded as, an example employer of best practice almost. So certainly the armed forces is the one that I've got personal experience with in terms of having worked with them for many years, to see that they've actually made particularly great strides. But there's one other quick question I wanted to quickly add in, if I can, is, you know, I've done a second piece of consultancy for SCONO, which just finished. I think Jeanette knows which one I'm talking about, and it was looking at EDI data, because one of the things that we've got a problem with in the academic and library sector is we don't have that evidence base from data. And why we don't have it is because in some ways the libraries are slightly at a disadvantage because they are part of a wider institutional network. They don't collect their own data. They don't have the ownership of that data. They have to rely on data coming from elsewhere in the institution at the center of the organization. So there are, you know, some developments in that front as well, be able to report them. But certainly in terms of example of good practice and success stories, I would actually, you know, definitely talk about the armed forces as being one. And I know that all these other organizations I referred to in the public sector, like the NHS, etc., they are also doing a lot now in putting into place you know, measures to root out this kind of you know, unconscious bias, but it's not easy to do because people first have to accept that they have the bias in the first place. There's no point trying to root it out unless you reflect on it. So people need to reflect on the way they talk, the way they behave towards people from diverse backgrounds, you know, regardless of the characteristics. And if they are willing to acknowledge that there is a problem, a root problem, then I think you can achieve success. But if you just simply say to someone, your behavior is poor, you're going to do unconscious buying, it's going to be of no use. That person has to take stock and actually decide that they have an issue, accept and acknowledge your problem, and then go and get the help and medicine, if you like, and then you find the cure.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. I'm mindful of the fact that we are off our time, but there are just two questions, and if people can bear with me, it'd be great for Mohammed to try and answer those questions. I think the first is from Perpetual. This was a really interesting presentation. It's always surprising to hear that even in different sectors, the stories and experiences are very similar. Thank you. My question is that one of your recommendations is mentoring, but do you think that there should be a cutoff point when it shouldn't be considered for employees? For example, someone who has been there for years and is competent but hasn't been given the opportunity.
Yes, I agree. I understand. That's a very good question. I actually agree. I think mentoring does divide opinion. There's a lot of talk nowadays is, you know, is mentoring really the right way? You know, do people actually need a mentor, or do they just need fairness and opportunities? You know, should the line manager just be able to come to someone and say, look, you know what? You know, we looked at your profile, you've been here for many, many years, you know, you've obviously got the skills and qualities, but you know, you haven't been applying, or you felt you have applied and you haven't been successful. And I think you know, we need to support, see how we can get you there. Is there any you know, institutional barriers that are preventing you from getting that level? And I think one of the ways of actually helping people in that situation is look at the way you recruit and select, particularly look at the promotion panels. Look at how they are made up of. Who sits on the promotion panels? Is it all white people? Do we have diversity? Do we have men and women? Do we have people from different, you know, backgrounds, etc.? Because that can make a massive difference. You know, it's a bit like a jury in a court. You know, if you're a BAME defendant standing for trial, your chances of being found guilty is greater if the jury is all white, right? You know, so I think you know, it's you know, you've got to look at all sorts of different dynamics, and it's you know, but I do agree that mentorship doesn't work for everyone, and it certainly is not something you might feel you need if you're already very experienced and you've got the quality. You might actually find being offered a mentor patronizing, actually.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. And the final question, because I want us to conclude in the next 2 minutes. Was there a gender or age dynamic within your findings? I think that was by Paulette. She wants to find out whether there was a gender or age dynamic within the findings.
Yeah, unfortunately, again, very good question, Paulette. I think the issue there was that, you know, because it was a qualitative piece of research and, you know, the sample size wasn't massive, you know, it was very difficult to sort of separate out. But I didn't see anything from although we did have a very diverse gender or age you know, representation in both the focus group and the interviews, I didn't really see any major differences that obviously stood out from a kind of age or gender perspective, if I'm being absolutely honest. But I think I didn't, you know, consciously look for those specifically. and also because the sample size, as I said, was, the nature of the study was such, I think it was, if it was a survey or a questionnaire, it might have been slightly different. We'd had, say, over 100 responses. But one of the problems you've got to remember is that when Sconal did the original research to carry out the demographic survey, Sconal had sent out the survey asking BAME staff who identified themselves as BAME to complete it. So we don't know how many BAME staff Sconal members have because we don't have any monitoring. So, we were relying on people self-identifying themselves as BAME in the first place to actually take part in the survey. So no, I didn't look at that, but that would be something would be interesting, I think, if we had a larger sample size.
Okay, thanks very much, Mohammed, for that, and thanks everyone for attending. I'm sorry that we went beyond 2 o'clock. I think it's 5 minutes past 2, but I think it has been a very great session, very informative, very interesting, very thought-provoking as well. I'm so glad, Mohammed. I know you're very busy, and I really appreciate you coming to share your research with us. And of course, everyone that came as well, based on the feedback on the chat, I believe that you all found it very useful. Unfortunately, we just have to stick to time and we have to go. But of course, we have more seminars. We have another one in 2 weeks' time on the 15th. So watch this space. We'll be looking at knowledge transfer partnerships. So please try to attend that one as well. But thanks, everyone. I think, Mohammed, you want to say some final words before?
Yes, thank you very much for inviting me today. I am never, ever busy to talk about my research. Okay, so if anyone wants to contact me, it'll be a pleasure to hear from anyone, even offline. They can email me directly. My profile is public. And I'm really grateful for everyone coming today to, asking some very informative questions. And I hope to continue the work in this area. And, I'm always happy to liaise with anyone who's interested in this to discuss it further. And thank you to you, Christian, for organising these fantastic seminars. And I haven't been able to attend many in the past, but certainly I find that really, really interesting today. And it was really, it's an area I feel very passionate about. And I hope that we can make sort of progress, both as an institution and more widely going forward. So thank you very much to everyone for all your fantastic questions and your participation today.
Okay, like Mohammed has said, he's always available to talk about his research. He's very generous. So please contact Mohammed. Thank you very much and have a nice day.
Bye. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.